The woman known to history as Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg, who would later be known as Catherine the Great, was born on the 2nd of May, 1729, in the city of Stettin, in Prussian Pomerania, in modern-day Poland. Her mother, Joanna Elizabeth, was the daughter of Christian August of Holstein-Gottorf, who in turn was the youngest son of Christian Albert, Duke of Holstein-Gottorf, and his wife, the daughter of King Frederick III of Denmark, Princess Fredrika Amalia. Sophie's father was Christian August, Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, who rose to prominence within Prussia as a military commander under its king, Frederick the Great, and after a long military career, was made a Knight of the Order of the Black Eagle, which was Prussia's highest chivalric order, and was later ultimately promoted to the rank of General Field Marshal of the Prussian Army in 1742. Sophie was born into the noble elite of Prussian society, meaning that she was given the very best education from an early age, under the tutelage of a French governess, although she later stated in reference to her youth that she could see nothing of interest in it. Despite her family's titles, lineage, and military background, Sophie's parents were relatively poor, meaning that her rise to power within Russia would come to depend on the backing of her mother and close family, who, due to Prussia's rivalry with Austria, would soon seek her hand in marriage to her second cousin, Peter of Holstein-Gottorf, who was in contention to succeed Empress Elizabeth to the Russian throne. The reason for the Prussian Peter being a candidate to succeed Elizabeth was that the Russian Empress had remained unmarried and thusly childless, and had instead satisfied her apparently voracious nocturnal desires by bedding a series of commoners, including an army sergeant and a number of lowly serfs. Despite failing to produce an heir, Empress Elizabeth is also remembered today as continuing her father Peter the Great's modernization of Russia that had seen the Tsardom transformed from a backward, medieval feudal kingdom into a resurgent European power that had reclaimed large portions of the Baltic coast from the Swedes, who had conquered Ingria over 100 years before. After Peter the Great's death in 1725, the Russian throne was occupied by 4 Tsars in 16 years, including Peter's second wife, Catherine I, who died in 1727, and his grandson from his first marriage, Peter II, who died at the age of 14 in 1730. The throne was then taken by Anna, the daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother Ivan V, until 1740, when Ivan V's last surviving great-grandchild, the infant Ivan VI, ascended to the Russian throne, but was shortly afterwards deposed by Peter the Great's daughter Elizabeth in 1741. Although some historians claim the Russian Enlightenment began in the reign of her father, Peter the Great, Elizabeth's ascension to the Russian throne marked the introduction of the concept of enlightened absolutism, otherwise known as benevolent despotism across the Tsardom, that had been first theorized in an essay by the Prussian king Frederick the Great in an attempt to fuse the form of governance that is absolute monarchy with the new theories and philosophies of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment itself was a period in 18th century Europe when scientists and philosophers were beginning to question the old-held assumptions of Western civilization, primarily by the use of reason that began to erode the grip of the Catholic faith, as well as the supposed divine right of the continent's absolute monarchies, in favor of more scientific, individualist, libertarian philosophies and freedoms that would in time pave the way for the rise of liberalism and even socialism in the 19th century, as well as science itself. Naturally, many European rulers struggled to come to terms with these new ideas. However, the more enlightened monarchs, such as Frederick the Great, who can perhaps be best described as a benevolent dictator, used the concept of enlightened absolutism to essentially maintain their grasp on power by promoting education for the upper and middle classes, religious tolerance, and increased freedom of speech, as well as private property rights. Indeed, many European rulers subsequently adopted benevolent despotism over the coming decades, including Frederick the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Catherine the Great herself, and it could even be said that the concept of enlightened absolutism even persisted well into the 20th century in Europe, finally meeting its demise after World War II, as some claimed that the likes of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong were enlightened despots, which is hotly debated. Elizabeth, however, would come to embrace the ideas and policies outlined by the likes of Frederick the Great, which would in turn shape the rule of Catherine the Great over the coming years, who would herself continue to modernize Russia and in the process become one of the Tsardom's most venerated and respected monarchs. As she grew older, it became evident to Elizabeth that producing an heir was impossible. Therefore, she decided that upon her death, the Russian throne would pass to her nephew, Charles Peter Ulrich of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorf, the only surviving child of Elizabeth's elder sister Anna, who had died in 1728 of a bacterial infection just 4 days after her son's birth. Another reason for Elizabeth choosing her nephew to succeed her was her fear of a coup in support of the deposed Ivan VI, who she had herself deposed and had since kept in solitary confinement and given his jailers express orders that if any escape or coup was attempted, he was to be eliminated immediately. The prospect of Peter becoming Russia's new Tsar inevitably made him the most eligible bachelor in Eastern Europe, and it was this prospect, combined with both Sophie's and Peter's family connections within Prussia, that would eventually see her become his bride. As well as this, the marriage also had powerful backers within the Prussian state itself, in the shape of Frederick the Great, who along with one of Empress Elizabeth's top advisors, Jean-Armand de Lestock, wanted to forge greater ties between Prussia and Russia against Austria. However, these plans were in turn opposed by Elizabeth's chancellor, Alexei Bestuzhev, who supported a pro-Austrian and anti-Prussian foreign policy. According to accounts, Sophie and Peter had first met when she was 10 and he was 11, shortly after he had been named Duke of Holstein-Gottorf, upon his father Charles Frederick's death in 1739. However, the meeting between the two was not exactly love at first sight, as Sophie disliked her suitor's complexion, drinking, and fondness of playing with toy soldiers. In 1742, at the age of 14, Peter relocated to Russia, where his Aunt Elizabeth made him King of Finland, after Russia retook the country in the Russo-Swedish War, and shortly afterwards, Sophie, along with her mother, joined her future husband in Russia in 1744. Over the coming months, Sophie took the time to ingratiate herself with Russian customs, and evidently quickly became attached to her new home, as within a matter of months she became fluent in Russian, and is said to have been liked by Empress Elizabeth. Despite evidently impressing the Russian court, illness almost cut Sophie's life short in 1744, by what she would later describe as an attack of pleurisy, or an inflammation of the lungs, that nearly killed her, and at one point when her mother called for a Lutheran Protestant priest, Sophie roused from her slumber and cried, "I don't want any Lutheran, I want my Orthodox father." In the end, Sophie made a full recovery, with the aid of bloodletting, meaning that the formalities for her marriage to Peter were soon able to continue, and finally, despite her parents' reservations, Sophie was formally accepted into the Russian Orthodox Church on the 28th of June, 1744, where she was renamed Ekaterina, or Catherine, and a year later, on the 21st of August, 1745, at the age of 16, she was finally married to Peter in the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. After the ceremony, both Peter and Catherine made their home in the Russian royal residence of Oranienbaum, west of St. Petersburg, where they would hold court. However, the couple's union proved to be an unhappy, distant one, as the two disliked each other, and there are rumors that both took lovers and lived at opposite ends of the palace. This dislike for one another would over the years evidently turn into hatred and suspicion, as Peter became increasingly unpopular within the royal residence, as he would drill his servants in the early hours of the morning, and would also burst into Catherine's room late at night and keep her awake, with his drunken singing, leading her to state that he was an idiot and a good-for-nothing drunkard from Holstein. Despite their evident disdain for one another, Peter and Catherine nonetheless parented at least one and possibly two children together over the coming years, a son, the future Emperor Paul I, in 1754, and a daughter Anna in 1757, who died in infancy, prompting Peter, who evidently suspected that the child was not his own, to state to go to hell when he was confronted with the baby's body, which no doubt greatly hurt his wife and only increased her hatred of him. Indeed, Catherine would later claim that she had never shared a bed with Peter at all, thusly meaning that all of her children were illegitimate. However, there is no concrete evidence to suggest that this is true, and over the coming years, Catherine would go on to parent 2 more children, Alexei in 1762 and Elizabeth in 1775, both of whom were the fruits of her various lovers' loins. Then, on Christmas Eve, 1761, Empress Elizabeth suffered a massive stroke. She had been complaining of dizzy spells for some time, but had point blank refused to take any of the medications her physicians had prescribed her, and had even forbidden anyone to mention the word death in her presence. However, regardless, her health went into rapid decline over the following weeks, and she ultimately passed away on the 5th of January, 1762, aged just 52. This was the day that both Peter and Catherine had been waiting for, and soon afterward he was crowned as Emperor of Russia, whilst Catherine was given the title of Empress Consort, before both moved from their Oranienbaum residence to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. But despite ascending to the throne, Peter showed little sign of changing his ways, and his reign would ultimately prove to be unpopular and short. Discontent against the new emperor first manifested itself when Peter decided to support Prussia's Frederick the Great, who, despite previously trying to improve relations with Empress Elizabeth, had ultimately found himself fighting against Russia in the global conflict that is now known as the 7 Years' War, in which Prussia and its ally Great Britain fought against France, Austria, the Russian Empire, Spain, and Sweden, as well as others, and against the odds emerged victorious. Indeed, the turning point of the 7 Years' War from a Prussian perspective was Empress Elizabeth's death, as their war effort was in dire straits by this time, the low point coming when the Russians sacked Berlin in October of 1760. However, Peter, who after all had been born in the now German city of Kiel, greatly admired Frederick the Great, and 2 months after his ascension to the Russian throne, the new Tsar signed a peace treaty with Prussia, and afterwards sent troops to aid Frederick the Great against his Austrian arch-enemies. This in turn effectively swung the war in Eastern Europe in Prussia's favour, as they would ultimately emerge victorious from the 7 Years' War, after securing Silesia in October of 1762, that forced the Austrians to the negotiating table the following year, at which they signed the Treaty of Hubertusburg on the 15th of February 1763, that established Prussia as a major European power that would one day unite all of Germany under its rule. After this, Emperor Peter sought to extend Russia's influence over the Danish territory of Schleswig in order to bring it under the umbrella of his neighbouring duchy of Holstein-Gottorp. However, the Danes, understandably being greatly alarmed by this course of events, then threatened to annex the free city of Hamburg in northern Germany in order to force the city's banks to give them loans in order to keep fighting. Peter saw this as all the justification he required, and therefore dispatched 45,000 Russian troops. However, the emperor would never get the chance to seize Holstein, as by this time, events in Russia were about to overtake him, as the country's nobility had become greatly discontented with his rule, and in particular his decision to ally with the Prussians against Austria. Peter, who seems to have been oblivious of the hatred his court and nobility had for him, then left St. Petersburg in July of 1762, along with his German-born courtiers and relatives, for a short break at his old residence of Oranienbaum. But Catherine, however, conspicuously stayed behind, as she had in the 6 months since her husband's ascension been plotting with the Russian opponents of Peter to take the throne for herself. However, shortly after Peter left St. Petersburg, Catherine then learned that one of her co-conspirators had been arrested. Thusly, the Empress crossed the capital and headed to the headquarters of the elite Izmailovsky regiment of the Russian army, where she made a speech in which she begged for the soldiers' support and protection against her husband. Luckily for Catherine, instead of arresting her, the soldiers agreed. Therefore, she then left for the nearby Semenovsky barracks, where the Orthodox clergyman was standing by to formally proclaim her as the sole Empress of the Russian Empire. And so, shortly afterwards, Catherine, with the full backing of the Russian state and church, formally took power and ordered her husband to be taken into captivity. Peter, who had been outmaneuvered, was finally taken prisoner on the 9th of July, 1762, and whilst in custody, signed away his throne in a formal abdication, before being transported to the Ropsha Palace outside of St. Petersburg, where according to accounts, he was assassinated on the 17th of July by Grigory Orlov, who was the brother of Catherine's lover and favourite Alexei Orlov, who had played a crucial role in the coup. However, it should be said that there is no certainty as to how Peter met his end, as it is unclear if Orlov was acting under orders or his own initiative. However, Catherine's ascension was not met with applause from all sides, as later in 1764, a plot was foiled to release Ivan VI from captivity, who had been imprisoned by Empress Elizabeth, meaning that he was soon dispatched as a consequence, no doubt on Catherine's express orders. However, despite this, her legitimacy to rule is still hotly debated today, as some historians question whether Catherine was really the official Empress of Russia, or if she was in fact merely the regent for her son Paul, and there were even rumours of a coup to depose her in the 1770s, in order to place her son onto the throne instead. Nonetheless, after her husband's death, few could challenge Catherine, who, on the 22nd of September 1762, was formally crowned as Empress of Russia at the Assumption Cathedral in Moscow, for which a new crown was made, that is known as the Russian Imperial Crown, that was crafted from over 70 pearls and 5,000 Indian diamonds that covered 2 gold and silver spherical lobes representing the Eastern and Western Roman empires, in the middle of which was mounted a large ruby under a diamond-encrusted Orthodox cross. After her coronation, Catherine set about the affairs of the Russian state and began to implement her intended program of reform and modernization, as she was determined that her empire should be the equal of its European rivals, especially in terms of the strength of its economy, which was largely dependent on cheap, low-skilled peasant or serf labor. This class of peasants that had once been common across much of Europe had by the 18th century steadily decreased in numbers, until finally countries such as Russia were amongst the last to incorporate serfdom into its social order, whereby workers or labourers would be given a parcel of land to work on, for which they would pay their landlord a certain fraction of their crops or livestock. Catherine, who, like many rulers, was wary of liberating the lower classes, stopped short of reforming or even abolishing serfdom completely, but instead gave serfs the right to lodge complaints with the local governors against their landlords, which gave Russia's poorest some measure of protection and rights, although Catherine's real reasons for establishing a process of grievance is said to have been because she did not want to deal with the serfs' complaints herself. This disdain of the poor is also evidenced by Catherine gifting state-owned farms to nobles, meaning that their workforce then became serfs overnight, and she even reversed a proclamation of Peter the Great that prevented the Orthodox Church from owning serfs, that would in time come to have serious consequences, as there was a large revolt of serfs across Russia between 1773 and 1775 against the increasingly punitive and strict rules the nobility were imposing on them. This rebellion that is known today as Pugachev's Rebellion, after Yemelyan Pugachev, a former army officer who used the widespread unrest to set up an alternative government in the name of the late Tsar Peter III, which was located in the area between the Volga River and the Ural mountain chain. In an attempt to rally the support of the peasantry, Pugachev outlawed serfdom, which presented Catherine's government with a considerable problem, as it was a challenge to the imperial administration and the power of the nobility, as well as Catherine herself, both of whom were dependent on peasant labour. However, this insurrection was not to last, as Pugachev was soon captured, tried, and executed in Moscow in January of 1775, after which his reforms were reversed in earnest. This episode clearly illustrated to Catherine the limitations and even dangers that abolishing serfdom could present, but also showed the limitations of having a large population of unskilled serfs within Russia, as the country's economy from the ground up was entirely dependent on having an abundance of cheap unskilled labour, meaning that there were relatively few skilled professions available, which were vital if the empire was to modernise and compete with the Western powers. In an effort to rectify this, Catherine then decided to supplement the unskilled Russian workforce by encouraging foreign migration eastwards, especially by German farmers, into the more fertile regions of her empire, particularly around the basin of the river Volga. These farmers, who, being proficient in the more modern Western methods of farming, soon helped to increase agricultural output, especially in the cultivation of crops such as wheat and tobacco, as well as the raising of livestock, that in turn enabled professions such as carpentry and ironworking to grow more common. This policy soon paid Catherine dividends, as during her reign the Volga region became the agricultural centre of the Russian economy, which also came to prosper under her leadership, due to other measures such as the printing of paper money and the opening of banks. That proved to be crucial, as until this time the Russian state had been almost entirely dependent on metal currency, in turn meaning that if gold, silver and copper were in short supply, coins could not be minted, which combined with the scarcity of metal caused rapid price inflation. As well as the economy, Catherine instigated an overhaul of the Russian education system, which like the other areas of her empire lagged desperately behind the country's European rivals, and to rectify this, the Empress established an education commission which during her reign would transform the education of many of her subjects from 5 to 15 years of age in the new Western style. These reforms were overseen by Catherine's educational advisor, Ivan Betskoy, and included the setting up of special orphanages such as the Moscow Foundling Home and the Smolny Institute, which was a special school for girls, firstly of noble and later of the middle classes. Indeed, Catherine insisted that her younger subjects, be they girls or boys, should receive an education, and later in her reign, these educational reforms would also be rolled out across Russia, and estimates suggested that over 60,000 pupils passed through Catherine's state schools during her reign, which are said to have numbered in the region of 550 across Russia's many provinces. These schools were not like their modern contemporaries, as playtime was forbidden in favour of a curriculum based on the learning of mathematics, science, history, basic skills and morals, as well as respect for the Empress, and was enforced by means of incredibly strict discipline, in what were, according to accounts, extremely cold classrooms, as it was thought that the heat was not good for children's health or concentration. Another flaw of Catherine's educational reforms was that many noble families point blank refused to send their children to state schools, and as well as this, lower middle class families objected to the Western style curriculum. But despite these problems, it is widely acknowledged that Catherine did improve and enlarge the Russian school system. However, she did not believe that peasants should receive an education, as she thought they were easier to control if they were ignorant, and she even at one point stated in a letter to an advisor that plebeians should not be educated, otherwise they will know as much as you or I. Given her evident dislike for the unwashed masses, it is fair to state that Catherine's adoption of Enlightenment thinking merely extended to cultural and scientific affairs, or in other words, in ways that would be of benefit to her, as clearly, from her point of view, an educated peasantry was not desirable, whereas an educated middle class and strong industrial base would strengthen Russia against its rivals, and in doing so strengthen her. Indeed, it could be argued that Catherine was an enlightened modernizer, providing that she benefited from it. The reforms that were arguably closer to Catherine's heart than any other were her now famous patronage of Russian arts and literature, including the most famous example, which is the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which was established in 1764 and is renowned for housing the largest number of paintings on Earth. And despite claiming that she was no connoisseur of the arts, merely a lover of them, Catherine did try her hand at producing her own creative works, including fictional stories, her own memoirs which are extensive, as well as comedies. Her work even earned the praise of some of Europe's most celebrated writers and philosophers, such as Voltaire, who Catherine exchanged correspondence with for nearly 15 years, and who gave her the title of the Star of the North. And even though the two never met, the Empress grieved for Voltaire when he died in 1778, and later brought from his relatives the majority of his book collection, which is now housed in the National Library of Russia. Despite these reforms, Catherine is perhaps best known today for her liberated personal life, as she famously never remarried after her husband's death, and instead took numerous lovers during her reign, and despite the fact that various accounts state that the Empress was not particularly beautiful, she nonetheless took advantage of her position to seduce many of the young and ambitious men within her court, who were eager to earn her favour. It could even be said that the reason Catherine did not take a second husband was due to her wishing to maintain control over all state affairs, possible proof of which can be found in the fact that she did not retain any of her numerous lovers for long, and often cast them aside when she grew bored or met someone more interesting. Despite this, nearly all of Catherine's lovers, when she was finished with them, were rewarded with titles, lands, or pensions for life, and in return, many of them would do favours for the Empress, an example of which was Grigory Potemkin, who suggested a suitable lover to replace him after his relationship with Catherine had ended, and would later become a crucial figure in her regime, particularly in her wars against the Ottomans. Indeed, some say that Catherine even married Potemkin, although there is no evidence for this. However, what is certain is that the Empress enjoyed the company of as many as 22 different men of varying ages and social standings during her reign, from mere commoners to aristocrats, all of whom were rewarded for their nocturnal endeavours, with large sums of money, estates, and in some cases, thousands of serfs. These included Alexander Dmitry Manonov, Nicholas Alexander Suk, Pietra Zavadovsky, Prince Zubov, and Grigory Orlov, with whom Catherine parented a son named Alexei. However, perhaps the most famous and important lover Catherine took was Stanislav Poniatowski, who it is claimed was the real father of Catherine's deceased daughter Anna. However, this is contested. What is certain is that the pleasures of the flesh were extremely important to Catherine, as she even collected erotic furniture and works of art during her lifetime, such as tables with male members for legs, as well as other furniture with both male and female genitalia carved into erotic patterns, along with revealing suggestive pictures, as well as statues throughout her palaces. As well as this, the Empress even had prospective lovers vetted or tested by her ladies-in-waiting, including Countess Praskovia Bruce, who would spend a night with every and any gentleman who caught the Empress's eyes, or vice versa. However, when the Countess became close to one of Catherine's latest lovers, she was dismissed from her position, as she had incurred the Empress's severe displeasure. All this paints a figure of a woman who delighted in the pleasures and luxury her position afforded her, who, as well as being a competent and intelligent ruler, was also determined to enjoy her life and reign to the full and maintain control over every aspect of her life, from warfare and diplomacy to romance and bedtime pursuits. Indeed, the French author Charles-François Philibert Masson stated that Catherine had but two passions that never left her until her last breath, those being the love of man, which degenerated into licentiousness, and the love of glory that sunk into vanity. Upon ending her relationships, Catherine would also reward her lovers with positions of power. The most famous of these, as previously mentioned, was Stanislav August Poniatowski, who, after their relationship ended, Catherine later supported in his successful candidacy to become the new king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1763, after the death of its king Augustus III. However, this soon sparked fears from the likes of Frederick the Great that Catherine intended to marry Poniatowski, thusly forming a Polish-Russian union. However, the Empress denied this and insisted that her new Polish puppet king should marry another woman instead. A constitutional monarchy, Poland and Lithuania had been a united kingdom for hundreds of years, but given that its rulers did not have absolute power over the kingdom, its government was often paralysed by indecision, and its nobles were often bribed by the surrounding powers to stop reforms and new legislation, which ultimately culminated in the kingdom, along with its new king falling under Catherine's thumb. One of the foreign leaders who regarded the Commonwealth with envious eyes was Prussia's king Frederick the Great, who had long hated the Slavs, and in particular the Poles, whom he had great disdain for, and had once even stated that all these people with surnames ending with ski deserve only contempt. The Prussian king, along with other regional powers bordering Poland, such as Russia, had for a long time been vying with one another to gain greater influence over the country, although as time went by, Catherine the Great and Russia began to exert a particularly strong influence over Poland-Lithuania, as is evidenced by Stanislav Poniatowski's ascension to the throne. Frederick, however, had long wanted to join the Kingdom of Prussia with Eastern Prussia, and had steadily been undermining Poland through various means, such as printing Polish banknotes in order to devaluate its currency, and preventing the Polish government at any opportunity he could to reform or modernize by means of bribery or threats. These policies ultimately culminated in Frederick, with the help of his brother Prince Henry Frederick, agreeing to the first partition of Poland in 1772, in which Prussia, Austria, and Russia occupied various areas of Poland-Lithuania by occupying them with their respective armies, which made all three countries more powerful and wealthier, while simultaneously weakening their neighbour, effectively signalling the beginning of the end of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as the kingdom would later be divided twice more in 1793 and 1795. After the first partition of Poland, Catherine then sought to expand Russia's borders in other areas, and as war with the major European neighbours was not seen as advisable, the Empress's choice instead was to seek territorial gain to the south, which would inevitably lead to conflict with the powerful Muslim Ottoman Empire. Before embarking on aggressive expansion, however, Catherine agreed a trade agreement with Great Britain in 1766, but stopped short of entering into a full military alliance, as she feared that doing so would make the island nation even more powerful than it already was, as it had emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War. Therefore, she calculated that close ties with the country could potentially anger and isolate the continent's other major powers. It was perhaps her reluctance to go to war against Russia's rivals to the west that prompted Catherine to turn her attention to the south, as in the time of Peter the Great, Russia had sought to gain territory in the Azov region of the Black Sea. However, Catherine's predecessor had been unable to secure Russian domination of the region. Therefore, the Empress now sought to wrestle control of the Black Sea ports from the Ottoman Empire in what is now known as the First Russo-Turkish War from 1768 to 1774. During this conflict, Catherine's armies dealt the Ottomans a series of defeats that included the naval battle of Chesma that took place from the 5th to the 7th of July 1770 off the northern Anatolian coast, in which a Russian fleet decimated the Ottoman navy, effectively giving Catherine near total domination of both the Black Sea as well as the Aegean as a result. This success was then added to on land in the Battle of Kagul on the 21st of July 1770, that many regard to be one of the largest land battles of the 18th century, in which a Russian army of 40,000 men inflicted massive losses on an Ottoman and Crimean Khanate force nearly double its size in Moldavia, in which nearly 20,000 Muslims were killed, which essentially brought the majority of southern Ukraine under Catherine and Russia's control. Although she had previously converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, Catherine did not practice her faith with any great enthusiasm. Indeed, she would, during her reign, seize church property and even sell the belongings of the country's clergy and monasteries to pay for her wars. But on the other hand, she still protected the Orthodox religion by restricting and regulating the practice of other faiths, such as Catholicism and Islam, and offered foreigners financial inducements to convert to the Orthodox faith upon immigrating to the country. However, Catherine's policies towards Jews were entirely different from her policies towards other religions, and even though there was only a tiny number of Jewish people in Russia at the beginning of her reign, in 1772, Catherine, along with Maria Theresa of Austria, agreed to the previously mentioned plan devised by Frederick the Great of Prussia, in which the three nations would seize large portions of land from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This, at a stroke, added hundreds of thousands of Jews to the Russian population, and so Catherine allowed her new subjects to effectively live as separate entities within Russian society, independent of the church, in return for higher taxes, although Jews who converted were exempt from these taxes, and also allowed to join the mercantile classes as free citizens, which in turn was unpopular with Catherine's other subjects, eventually leading her to ban Jews from Moscow's middle classes in 1790. Although these measures would today be seen as anti-Semitic, the Jews in truth fared about as well under Catherine as Russia's other religions, as the Orthodox Church itself was heavily taxed during her reign, in which Catherine even seized or closed churches and monasteries and prevented the clergy from having any say in the governance of the country, and severely restricted the teaching of Christianity in Russian schools. In short, the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great became more secular than ever before, as in reference to arts and culture she was evidently a true believer in the Enlightenment. However, any group, be it the church or peasantry, that could potentially challenge her rule was suppressed in many instances, whereas the nobility and middle classes were protected, as Catherine depended on them for the majority of her tax income, ministers of state, and army officers. To Catherine, science offered her far more than religion ever could, and as such she encouraged the emigration of as many scientists to Russia as possible, including botanists, mathematicians, and astronomers, including Anders Johann Lexell, who would, after moving to St. Petersburg and its state-funded Academy of Science, go on to make important contributions in the field of celestial mechanics and would ultimately have a comet named after him. As well as being a patron of science, Catherine was also eager to incorporate the principles of the Enlightenment into Russia's system of governance, and so in 1766 she established a Grand Commission in Moscow that was comprised of around 650 members who in turn came from various levels of Russian society, including government officials, the nobility, the burghers or middle classes, and lastly, the peasantry. The purpose of this new body was to identify issues or problems and find remedies to them, and to see that this prototype parliament did not overextend its remit, Catherine also issued a list of instructions that the commission was to rule in adherence with the philosophies and ideas of the Enlightenment. However, it soon became evident to many within the Russian nobility, as well as the empress herself, that this body was in danger of introducing a democratic government within Russia, meaning it was eventually disbanded. Despite this failure, the empress did undertake several governmental and legal reforms to the Russian state, including the setting up of provinces as well as districts across Russia, and restricting the power of the nobility by issuing the Charter of Towns in 1785, which placed all people into 6 social groups, in order to curtail the power of the nobility by creating a new upper middle class population, and these policies were also combined with other new laws concerning a wide range of sectors such as sea trade and even policing. It was around this time that the prospect of war with the Ottomans reared its ugly head once again, as Russia's southern rival attempted to retake the territories it had lost to Catherine in a conflict that is now known as the Second Russo-Turkish War between 1787 and 1792. However, the Ottomans were ultimately defeated once again, as Catherine's army seized control of the Crimea, before the Empress finally concluded a peace treaty with the Ottomans shortly afterwards. However, it was this second conflict with the Turks that gave Catherine's cousin Gustav III of Sweden the opportunity he had been seeking to attack his northern rival, as he was experiencing domestic discontent within Sweden at the time, and thusly decided to attack Russia along the Baltic coast in June of 1788, with the ultimate goal of assaulting St. Petersburg. But despite Gustav's best laid plans, the Russian Baltic fleet was able to defeat the Swedes in the Battle of Hogland on the 17th of July 1788, meaning that the Swedish king's plans for an invasion of Ingria were sidelined, as were any Russian hopes of advances, after the later Battle of Svensksund in July of 1790, in which the Russians were in turn defeated themselves, which forced both sides to conclude a peace treaty that was finally agreed in August of 1790. Spurred on by these successes, Catherine's final military adventure would be her war on Persia, in what is now known as the Persian Expedition of 1796, that started after the Muslim kingdom under Aga Muhammad Khan had invaded Russia's neighbour Georgia the year before, and as Russia had previously promised to protect Georgia from foreign aggression, Catherine ordered her forces to march against the Muslims. Many people within Russia assumed this expedition would be led by the veteran commander Ivan Gudovich. However, Catherine instead chose the relatively young and inexperienced Count Valerian Zubov, the brother of her lover Platon Zubov, who quickly pushed the Turks back into modern-day Iran. However, despite the successes of Valerian and the high regard the Empress had for his brother, would soon be cast into disfavour when Catherine's son Paul came to the throne after her death. During this time, Catherine began to change her mind about her previous policies of enlightened absolutism, as she, along with the majority of Europe's monarchs, had watched with horror at the unfolding events of the French Revolution of 1789 that many thought could easily spread across Europe and lead to the downfall of its royal dynasties. This increasing dislike for the philosophies of the Enlightenment was also increased by events within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that in 1791 enacted the May Constitution that was designed to bring about a constitutional monarchy in which the Polish nobility would be placed on an even social footing with ordinary townspeople and give the peasantry government support, effectively ending serfdom, as the nobility could no longer do as they wished with the lower orders. Catherine naturally saw this as a threat to the social order within Russia itself, and thusly decided to invade Poland in 1792, after which she decided to end any prospect of a resurgence of Polish democratic values by agreeing to the final partition of Poland between Russia and Austria in 1795, that saw the once proud and powerful Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth erased from the map of Europe entirely, until the two nations were eventually resurrected after the First World War in 1918. During the later stages of her reign, Catherine sought to mediate in the wars and struggles of her European neighbours by establishing the League of Armed Neutrality, which was a coalition of European countries who agreed to defend neutral shipping from the Royal Navy during the American Revolutionary War, as the British were seizing the merchant ships of other nations they believed were aiding the French, who were allied to the rebellious 13 colonies. In the last months of her life, Catherine sought to form greater ties with the new Swedish king, Gustav IV Adolf, when he visited St. Petersburg in the autumn of 1796, when Catherine attempted to arrange a marriage between Gustav and her granddaughter Alexandra, who she hoped would become the Queen of Sweden. Initially, all seemed to be going well, as a royal ball was arranged to be held on the 11th of September 1796, when the engagement of Gustav and Alexandria was due to be announced. However, much to Catherine's displeasure, the Swedish king failed to attend the festivities and instead left for Stockholm, as he was aggrieved that his prospective bride would not convert to the Lutheran Protestant faith. Catherine was so annoyed by this affront that her health was severely affected. However, she soon recovered over the coming weeks and began to make plans to announce her favourite grandson, Alexander, Paul's son, as her successor, as although Catherine had parented an heir to her throne in the shape of Paul, her regard for him was not much higher than that of which she held for his father. Therefore, she late in her reign decided to disinherit him in favour of her grandson. However, these plans would never come to fruition, as on the 16th of November 1796, Catherine awoke from a good night's sleep, but just after her breakfast collapsed from a severe stroke whilst on her commode, and was found unconscious on the floor of her chambers by her servants barely alive. Shortly afterwards, the empress was put to bed, and her attending doctor correctly diagnosed her as having had a stroke, but despite his best efforts, Catherine subsequently fell into a coma and ultimately died the following evening, on the 17th of November 1796, at the age of 67, in the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg. Over the coming days, an autopsy was carried out on the late empress, which concluded that she had indeed died from a cerebral hemorrhage. However, despite this, various rumours arose regarding her demise, including one which stated that she met her end engaging in relations with a horse, when the harness holding her equine companion in position above her broke, crushing her under its weight. Another tall tale regarding Catherine's final moments even stated that she was dispatched by means of spring-loaded blades hidden in her toilet seat that had been activated when she sat down. However, historians agree that all of these accounts are fanciful in the extreme, and ultimately, Catherine the Great was laid to rest wearing a silver brocade dress and a golden crown in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Despite Catherine's wishes, she was succeeded by her son Paul, who became Paul I of Russia. However, the new emperor's mother would get her way in the end, as Paul himself was assassinated in March of 1801 at the age of 46, and was in turn succeeded by his son and Catherine's favourite grandson, Alexander I, who would go on to become one of Russia's most revered Tsars himself, as he led his country to victory during Napoleon Bonaparte's invasion in 1812. Although Catherine the Great was not Russian by birth, she is widely regarded as being one of her adopted country's most successful and venerated rulers, as she introduced the Enlightenment to the Russian Empire and brought about many reforms in its governance, including social and administrative changes, and also led it to numerous victories against its neighbouring rivals. Catherine is also one of the few women in history of the world who has been granted the title of Great, and despite being a foreigner, she was, after her death, as she was through the Soviet era to the modern day, widely respected and admired by the Russian people, as by the time of her death, she had made the country more powerful than it had ever been before. As well as this, Catherine's court and her personal life are amongst the most famous and controversial of any European ruler, as she largely rejected the old conventions of the Russian state and embraced the philosophies and ideas of the Enlightenment, both in the governance of her country as well as in her liberated and voracious private life. Catherine's critics also state that she deserves criticism for deposing her husband, and further claim that she was power-hungry in matters of state and was promiscuous in her bedchamber. However, to counter this, her supporters say as it was commonplace for male rulers to take numerous mistresses, Catherine can hardly be criticised for emulating them. Despite these successes, many of Catherine's critics state that her reforms and military victories were only secured on the advice or actions of her ministers and commanders. However, her supporters state that all of her reforms and victories were undertaken and secured on her own orders, and therefore she must bear the responsibility for and credit for their successes, and also state that she can hardly be criticised for having the intelligence to surround herself with extremely competent ministers and advisors that she could trust to implement her decisions. All in all, It is widely accepted that Catherine the Great is one of history's most powerful and remarkable women, who in a time of male supremacy proved herself to be the equal of her contemporary European rulers, and in many ways even proved herself to be superior to them. What do you think of Catherine the Great? Was she a power-hungry despot who sought to use the Russian state for her own pleasures and glory? Or was she one of history's greatest female rulers, who not only brought her country military successes, but also brought the values of the Enlightenment to her adopted country, and in the process made it more powerful than it had ever been before? Let us know what you think in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.